Hello and a very warm welcome to the Harrogate Literature Festival. My name is Gerry Foley. I'm a broadcast journalist and interviewer. As you know, the festival has been forced online this year, so we're particularly grateful to the continued support we get from our main sponsors, Rayworth Solicitors, who are based in Harrogate itself and have been supporters since 2012. So thank you very much for your continued help. And my guest today is Natalie Haynes, classicist, comedian and broadcaster. And Natalie is here to talk about her new book, Pandora's Jar, there, Women in the Greek Myths. Thanks for joining us, Natalie.
It's my pleasure. I miss being an actual Harrogate, though. Do you?
We all miss it. Of course we do.
I want to be at Betty's buying cake to bring home. I can't believe it. I genuinely schedule my trips to Harrogate around the Betty's. Yeah, they change cake sometimes, and I know. I feel so bad knowing this. I know that at the moment it would be parkin and not chocolate ganache cake. And I'd be happy with either, so it's fine. I do feel slightly shamefaced that I know their cake.
Well, I actually had a very nice slice of cake which my wife made.
Don't toy with me.
So yeah, I won't toy with you. It was really good. Victoria sponge, basically.
Well done.
All reliable. So from listening to some of your previous broadcasts and reading about you, you did Latin and Greek at school, and then you went on to Cambridge to study the classics. So from an early age, it was the ancient world which drew you in.
Yes, it had me at hello. I started doing Latin at 11, I think, or maybe 12, and Greek at 14. I took triple classics A-levels, which I'm pretty sure a school wouldn't let you do now because that is specialising very young. So I took Latin, Greek and ancient history. And then went to study classics at Cambridge and never looked back at every stage. I did some huge number, like 11 GCSEs or something, and I just didn't want that. At every stage, the idea of giving up a classics subject made me feel desperately sad. And so it was really like, oh no, I can't stop doing Latin because then I won't have Latin. I can't stop doing Greek because then I won't have Greek. And so it was a very kind of it was a weirdly emotional response to have, I think, to an academic subject. And I still feel like I exist in that sort of hinterland between, sometimes I feel like a sort of quite an academic person for a broadcaster and a novelist. And Pandora is quite an academic book and was read by academics before it was edited. And yet at the same time, it's always emotional to me. It's like, I love these stories. I love this account. And I think, oh God, that's not a very academic answer, is it?
Well, I know you have lots of supporters in the academic world who are great admirers of your work. But just going back briefly to Cambridge, because obviously you are fascinated by the subject, but you're also involved in the Cambridge Footlights in terms of performance and acting and comedy and everything else. Was there a tug of war there between the performance side of you and the academic side?
No, performance won hands down. It won hands down.
Really?
As soon as I walked out on stage the first time, I was like, this is what I want to be. And I still loved classics, but it felt very much like my, that's the thing I'm studying. And this is where my, career is going to be. They felt like they'd separated at that point. It just didn't occur to me. And to be fair, I don't feel bad that it didn't occur to me because I don't think it occurred to anyone else for quite a while until I came along and did it, that you could combine stand-up and classics. And that obviously is what I've done on tour for 10 years now, less so this year.
And Radio 4, obviously, highly successful.
Yeah, I mean, who knew it was going to be possible to say to people, I'm going to do stand-up about the ancient world and have them not go, okay, sweetheart, bye. See you soon, I miss you. Instead go, here you go, here's 1.6 million listeners an episode. You go, oh, great, good, I'm glad this has worked out.
When your book was being launched a few weeks back, you had a quote which sort of intrigued me, which said that anything which happened after the Romans left Britain, I'm not much interested in.
I just don't know it. I'm hopeless. To me, I say this over and over again, and I am never joking. When I read Wolf Hall, I read it as a thriller. I had no idea what was going to happen. The whole way through, I'm like, you're kidding. Beheaded? Are you sure? I thought she was going to get off for the whole book. And everyone always thinks it just isn't a joke. I just don't know. I mean, I know a little bit. I know little isolated blocks of time, but almost entirely from novels. I know that Sherlock Holmes isn't real, I think. That's about it.
Well, I don't want to break it to you or spoil it, but Henry VIII did end up having 6 wives, and it doesn't end well for any of them.
Right.
But that's a secret between us and this. Let's talk about your book.
Okay.
And I suppose the first thing we've got to talk about is obviously the title, the opening chapter, Pandora's jar.
Yes.
We've all been misled due to a mistranslation from the 15th, 16th century.
Yes, it's Erasmus's fault. So in Greek, Pandora is, in visual art, never depicted with any receptacle at all. And in literary accounts, sometimes a jar is mentioned and sometimes it isn't mentioned. But she never, ever, 100% of the time, ever has a box. Just not once, just not ever. She has occasionally a pithos, a jar.
Which is inherently unstable, you
they
said.
are inherently unstable.
Peculiarities, yeah.
Right, you've seen these in a museum. If you go and see a museum of antiquity anywhere in Italy or Greece, anywhere that is earthquake prone, you'll see that they tend to be, they're very, very narrow at the base. They come up to being very, very fat. And the Greeks or Romans often kept them kind of tilted on their sides, sort of stacked together so they'd support each other. But if you go and see them in a museum of antiquity somewhere where there are earthquakes, they're always strung together, on a display unit, because they're so precarious. It's like, if you're going to have, and only in some versions of her story is this the case, if you're going to have the world's evils and put them in a receptacle, do you know which one I wouldn't use? A jar. Gone for a terrible option. Just don't do it, guys. Just don't. And in some versions, I feel I have to say, in some versions of her story, Pandora's story, the jar is full of good things, according to Theognis in his elegies. In some versions, it's full of bad things. Hesiod says that, or the kind of care and hard work is what's in there. Although actually, I quite like caring and hard work. So maybe in this, as in so many ways, I don't fully coincide with the thinking of Hesiod. But yeah, it's only when Erasmus comes along to translate it. He takes the word pithos from Hesiod, jar, and translates it to the Latin word pixis, box. And within a really short space of time, sort of 30 years or so, you start seeing Pandora in paintings shown with like a strong box with, straps, malevolent effort to open this. And it's like, wait, how did this happen? For the Greeks, Pandora was an agent of change. She's sent to mortals by Zeus, well, technically by Hermes, but she's a gift from Zeus, to as a sort of accompaniment to, or in exchange for, or as a penalty for fire. Prometheus, the Titan, steals fire from the gods and gives it to us, and the payback or accompanying thing is Pandora. And so I think it's really interesting that we think of Pandora as being evil. It's because we've mapped her story onto the story of Eve, I think. And this notion of, a woman being responsible for the fall of man. It's like, oh, do me a favor. I figured it would be one of our faults, but thanks for making it clear. But actually, I think when you look at the way that we kind of operate in our world, things do change when fire arrives. It's a huge evolutionary step for human beings, is the arrival of fire, the discovery of fire. And so Pandora kind of brings that, she heralds that change with her. And it's like, well, is our life now more, is it less carefree than it would have been if we'd lived in it probably is, but what you tack into very early on in the first chapter and throughout the book, and you've mentioned it already, is the way in which these myths, the several versions of these, and your different versions, but some of them have become more established in the public mind, if you like. Right. And that's where the box comes in for Pandora. But also, Mark, in the first chapter, you talk about how women were totally excluded from Athenian society. They were locked away, cloistered, almost like nuns. They weren't allowed out. There's just great fear that if they were allowed out, they might catch the eye of another man. Certainly true for upper class women. Yeah, lower class women probably did have to go out for work and so on. But yeah, the posher you were, the less freedom you had in 5th century BC Athens. Yeah. But
you also, in the first chapter, talk a little bit about the fact that Pandora is on the Parthenon in Athens, obviously, as an important symbol for all women, for all womankind.
Yeah, because there aren't women before Pandora. So we're literally different, according to the Greek origin story, we're literally different races. You are descended from Eryxonius, and I am descended from Pandora. And so in visual art from the ancient world, Pandora is always shown at the point of being created, because all the gods get together to contribute to her creation. Hephaestus sculpts her out of clay. We can see vases where it looks kind of violent, but it isn't, I promise. She's being sort of hammered out of the ground. Because presumably that's how sculptors got their clay. And so that's the image that's that's then borrowed and put into Mount Olympus. And then all the other gods and goddesses kind of contribute. So the seasons and the hours and Athene, and they all come and offer some, skills or qualities or address in one case. And that's where, again, it's one of those things. Hesiod says that's why she's called Pandora, all gifted, because all the gods gave her a gift. But here's the thing, another linguistic shift. If Pandora is an active word, not a passive word. If it meant all gifted, it would be Pandosa. Pandora is all giving. So she is all gifted. The gods have all given her a gift. But she's also generous. As an adjective, Pandora is usually used to describe the earth, which is all giving of all those plants that we'll be eating, and so on and so on and so on. So again, it's a positive quality which we've taken away from her if we think of her as being the girl with the gifts.
You dedicate the book to your mum.
I do. She's really pleased, in case you were wondering. Oh, she's pleased.
You had a lovely photo online of the two of you, but actually it was the quote which intrigued me as well, which was that she always has more admiration for, what you say, a woman with an axe rather than a princess, which appeals to you, obviously.
I went with interest rather than admiration, just in case people thought my mum was actually a serial killer. My mum is not a serial killer. But yeah, my mum
You're correct. It is interest. Yeah, interesting.
My mum was never very interested in stories of princesses sort of sitting and waiting to be rescued. I remember her buying me a book when I was little called The Practical Princess, which was entirely about princesses who sort of went and sorted their own problems out and then rescued a prince on the way home. And that's exactly the daughter she ended up with, to be honest. So she's only got herself to blame. But yeah, I think
I wonder, Natalie,
because the women are so interesting.
Well, sorry to cut across, because I was wanted to sort of, I could link to the Amazons as a group of women, because that to me sort of triggered that reaction, because the collective power of women and the strength of women together. And as you say, the Amazons, well, you tell us about the Amazons, because their fashion sense, for starters, was very unique.
Incredible. Yeah, no, Amazons are amazing because they have a completely different ethos to warrior men in Greek narrative. So if we were to read, for example, the Iliad, Homer's incredible war narrative, what we see is an awful lot of very individualistic heroes fighting for themselves. Very occasionally you get a connection between two men, for example, Achilles and Patroclus, although we never see them fight alongside each other for reasons which are very clear. I won't spoil it for you, just in case. But generally, these men fight for individual glory. Kleos, fame that transcends your death, is the thing that you go for. I should say that when we meet Achilles in the underworld in book 11 of the Odyssey, he regrets this decision. He says to Odysseus, his shade says to Odysseus, that he'd rather be working the land as a living man than king among the dead. So, pursuit of glory at all costs, it turns out a little late in the day, to not have been the best choice he felt that he could make. But it's a very individualistic thing, whereas Amazons always fight in a gang. They're always a group. They defend each other and support each other. It's a really tribal thing. And it's another of the Greeks love binaries. They just love them. They love looking at things as gods and mortals, men and women, this and this, free and slave, another of their binaries. And it's another of the ways in which they can distinguish themselves. So the Amazons are already very strange because they don't behave like women who should obviously be cloistered at home in Athens, and instead they live in this place, Themyscira, without any men around. So how's that happen? They must be killing all the boy children whenever they arrive. And it's like that doesn't happen in, for example, Sparta anyway. And they dress in a very deviant way, and by deviant I mean that, for example, Amazons are shown wearing trousers, which is incredibly shocking to the Greeks, because of course what you should be wearing is a tunic, and then you should have bare legs. That's how a decent Greek man behaves, right? And a decent Greek woman should be wearing a longer version of the same. But Amazons wear a tunic top, and they have these incredibly, you can see them on vase paintings. Amazons were so popular on vase paintings. They're the second most popular mythological figures to be depicted on vases, after Hercules, to give him his Roman name. We have dozens and dozens of Amazon names written, dozens and dozens, hundreds and hundreds of images of Amazons fighting. And their clothes are so ornate. They have leggings or trousers, boots that they wear rather than having sandals or bare feet, and these incredible tunics which often have like a diamond or a square pattern on, which is not just decorative. It's almost certainly armor. So what you did was make these little tiny patches basically out of either flax or leather, which are then glued in layers onto the tunic. So it would act as extra armoring.
And one of the nice things also is in nearly every chapter, you bring the myth up to date in terms of its relevance to modern culture.
Yeah,
and in
Amazons
the case of
is
the
an
Amazons,
easy one. Yeah.
Yeah, well, go on, tell us
Well,
who
because
we should be
happily
watching.
for me, Wonder Woman has been rebooted in recent years, and indeed is about to be sequel rebooted as well, because Wonder Woman 1984 is due out pretty soon, I think.
And Buffy.
Say again?
Buffy the Vampire
And
Slayer.
Buffy, of course. I mean, the Amazons are actual Amazons. You know, the Amazons of Wonder Woman they live in a really interesting minor spelling variation, but they live in Themyscira exactly the same way as Greek Themyscira, but just with a little spelling switch so that they can, I presume, copyright it. And you know, Buffy is another case in point, a warrior woman who fights alongside other women, particularly in later seasons of Buffy. Again, I don't want to spoil it, so turn the sound down for a couple of minutes if you're not up to date with the final season of Buffy. But in the final season, she empowers all the other potential vampire slayers in the world so that they can all fight, so that the burden won't just be on her. And it's a really interesting retelling, I think, of that Amazon ethos, which is not individualistic glory, which you'd expect from something where she's the title character, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But actually what she wants to do is share it. She wants to share it with all these other young women so that they can, you know, share the burden and the glory.
Let's go to probably one of the most relevant figures from the ancient past to today, and that's Medusa. I know you're writing a novel, or planning to write a novel.
Yes.
But the story, the Me Too movement, we have to tell her story. But let's start with our basic story, and then we can bring it forward to why, even in the past week or two in New York, it's become very relevant to
Incredibly
modern.
so.
Yeah, so maybe the basic story.
Yeah, I mean, Medusa is the, and I fully trigger warning this whole section. Medusa is the original monstered rape survivor. So she is raped by Poseidon. I should say that in one account by Pindar, they have consensual sex, but usually it is a much less consensual encounter than that, certainly in Ovid, for example. And she is raped in the temple of Athene, and Athene prizes chastity, not in the same way that Artemis does, but still. And she's so outraged by the violation of her temple that she punishes not Poseidon, who you would think would be the responsible party here, but Medusa. Perhaps she's not strong enough to punish Poseidon, or perhaps she just does, as so many people have, blame the victim. And her response to Medusa's violation is to give her the snakes for hair. We've been told before that she's very beautiful, that her hair is the most, Ovid says her hair is the most beautiful thing about her. His narrator at that point says, I've heard it from somebody who saw her, which is a typical Ovidian detail. But she ends up with the snakes for hair, so her beauty is destroyed. And also she has this lithifying gaze, the power to turn things to stone if she looks at them. We don't know if that's part of Athene's transformation, or if it predates it. There's no mention of where exactly when the petrifying stare comes in. And then she retreats and stays with her sisters. I think it's interesting that we always think of her as a sort of a soul monster, because that's how she's usually depicted, but actually she's one of 3 Gorgons, and she and her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, all live together. And Perseus, who comes into the story later, the Gorgons predate Perseus by centuries. Perseus decides that he needs to, he's given a instruction by a king who wants to get him out of the way so he can shack up with Perseus's mother, that he needs to go and collect the head of a Gorgon. And Medusa is the only mortal Gorgon. And so Perseus gets the assistance of Athene and Hermes. He borrows a bunch of things, a hat of Hades that makes him invisible, and he has a kibesis, a sort of special backpack that you can carry, something like the head of a Gorgon in. And then he tracks Medusa down with a great deal more help from the Graii, the 3 sisters who share an eye and a tooth in some versions. And he decapitates her while she's asleep. And
It's the brutality of that act,
it is
actually.
incredibly brutal, because again, we're used to that version in the Ray Harryhausen movie in Clash of the Titans, where she is stalking him and he is stalking her, you know, where Harry Hamlin is behind a pillar and, you know, she's got a bow and arrow and she's all ready to, you know, attack him. She's killed one of his comrades and he's turned to stone and so on. So we're used to seeing it as a duel, and it simply isn't. You know, she's unconscious when Perseus decapitates her. It's an incredibly brutal scene, and you can see it in vase paintings from the ancient
And then
world.
he goes on to use the severed head to enhance his power, his standing.
Absolutely.
Because,
he uses her severed head as a weapon of mass destruction. There's an incredible moment where he turns Atlas, the giant, into a mountain. That's how the Atlas Mountains exist, I suppose. There's an incredible moment in Ovid where he gets sort of in a bit of a tiff with the occupants of an island, and he just turns the lot of them to stone in one go. It's really just petulance. And it makes him seem a lot less heroic. When you look at it, it's like, wow, he turns people to stone at his own wedding. And it's like, mate, just don't ask them if you don't want to. It's not obligatory. So yeah, he's a pretty rumman, I would say, Perseus.
And one of the aspects that you explore in that particular chapter is the idea of the Gorgon, the head, and the fact that they're described as having what you say is a grim noise. So they don't have a voice, and yet you say that's contrasted with other male figures who have plenty of time to explore and use their voice, even if in some cases it's just being good at shouting, as you say.
Right. So the Gorgons in general, but particularly when Medusa is slaughtered by Perseus and he runs away, her two sisters chase after him, and they're described as making this terrible noise, a baleful or direful sound like a dirge, and the language is always very negative. And I mean, in a way that makes sense. If you look at Gorgonaea, which are the heads of Gorgons that you often see on temples, sometimes we can read them being described on shields, because obviously it's just round, so that makes sense. They often have very, very wide mouths, and it would make sense that they could make a racket because they've got this big mouth, and often tusks as well. Sometimes pointing up and down. It's like, how do you even do that? But yes, so that is a common version of it, but it's always presented as a very negative thing that they make this noise. Whereas Diomedes, who we're told about in the Iliad with his Homeric epithet, is always translated as something like Diomedes of the great war cry, Diomedes, you know, terrifying as he, you know, calls or cries or shouts, but actually it literally means good at shouting, the Greek. And it's like, well, how come it's good when he shouts and bad when she does? It's almost as though we are holding people to different standards because of gender. I can't believe this has happened.
Just as well, it's in the ancient world and doesn't have any particular
I'm glad
relevance.
we've grown out of that. Goodness me.
Okay, we teased at the beginning of the conversation on Medusa about this very point, about Me Too, and where it's Medusa who has the severed head. It's not her head
Right,
which has been
absolutely.
severed. Explain why that's become so important and relevant to contemporary generations.
Yes, so there are a bunch of sculptures, in particular the Cellini and also the Canova. There's a copy in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which is particularly relevant at this point. And it's called Perseus Triumphant, and it's a beautiful statue in its way of a very handsome naked Perseus holding up the head of the decapitated Medusa. And you kind of look at it, I've walked past it dozens of times, and thought, yep, there he goes. And then you kind of go, no, wait a minute, sorry. He's only triumphant if you're on his side. Otherwise, he's a man glorying in the death of a woman. I know she's got snakes for hair, but it's not quite the same as George and the Dragon, is it? It is. And 2 years ago, in 2018, when Professor Christine Blasey Ford was giving her evidence about Brett Kavanaugh having assaulted her at college to the Senate Judiciary Committee, there was a reversal of this meme, a reversal of this image which circulated on the internet at remarkable speed, as memes tend to. And Medusa and Perseus had been used like this before. The Canova or the Cellini had been used in the 2016 presidential election with obviously the current president, I'm not sure when this broadcast, but let's hope he isn't still the current president by then, holding up the head of Hillary Clinton. And then when Christine Blasey Ford gave her evidence, there was a gender switched version of this image, which is a completely black background, and then it's a naked woman, Medusa. She looks beautiful, you know, she's got snakes for the hair, but they look like dreadlocks. She just looks incredibly human. And she's holding up the head of a young man. And in some versions of this image, it was just the gender reversal. But in some versions, there was text which said, next to her head at the top of the image, "Be thankful, we just want equality." And then down here next to his head, "and not payback." And the first time I saw that, I literally gasped, like that, on my own. And I just, and I thought afterwards, what on earth does that say about my prejudices, that I'm not shocked by the Canova, which I've seen in real life, but I'm shocked when you reverse it? Why? Am I honestly... And I realized that actually it wasn't just the prejudices of authors or artists that I needed to unpick in this book. It was mine as well. It's like, it shouldn't be more shocking to see a decapitated man than a decapitated woman. They should both shock us.
And yet, this very month in New York, outside the Manhattan court where Harvey Weinstein was found guilty, the city council has put up for 6 months a statue which reflects the new reality which you just described.
A copy of this, I think it's bronze, but a copy has been cast only, and it's gone up this week, the week we're recording, of this. The artist whose image it was when the meme went round is called Luciano Garbatti. He's Argentinian Italian, I think, and it's been cast by another artist this week, I think, but obviously with his involvement, and then put up outside the courtroom. And it's like that thing where you kind of go, oh my God, that feels so incredible to me, to see a piece of public art. And yes, it's violent and aggressive, but like I say, the Canova has been in the Metropolitan Museum of New York, and people walk past it in their thousands, tens of thousands every day. Let's
go on to a few other characters, because there are many in here. We're all familiar with the TV series, The Good Wife. Let's look at The Bad Wife. It's a tremendous story, this, actually. It really is. Well, you go on and tell who I'm talking about, Clytemnestra.
Clytemnestra is the absolute, she is the bad wife, or the worst wife, probably. But she's still the best wife, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of delight to write about. Because we're always presented with her as, I'm always suspicious, if I'm absolutely honest, of anyone who's presented to me as, the worst, the best. I bet they aren't, though. I bet they're more like a person. And Clytemnestra is a case in point, because she is always feared and reviled in Greek myth. Because, of course, at the beginning of the Trojan War, well, no, let's start with the end, shall we? And then we can see.
Yeah, start with the end.
When her husband Agamemnon, who has been the commander of the Greek armies at Troy, when he returns from the Trojan War, so he's been gone for 10 years fighting, and he comes home, Clytemnestra has begun an affair with his great enemy, a man named Aegisthus. And when he returns home, when Agamemnon returns home, she invites him into the palace. And while he's having a bath, at least in the version that we get in Aeschylus, she kills him with a sword. In some versions, it's an axe. In some versions, Aegisthus does the killing. But in the Aeschylus, the Agamemnon, which was first performed in 458, I think, BC, which is just the most magnificent play. I can't recommend it enough. She kills him with a sword. And the chorus say, this is appalling. How can you do this? You're a terrible kind of person. And she says, well, why do you value his life and not Iphigenia's? And Iphigenia is their daughter, or rather was their daughter. Clytemnestra and Agamemnon had a daughter. In fact, they've got another, Electra, and a son, Orestes, who she's shoved out of the way while this retribution occurs.
Although he may re-emerge to play a role.
in play 2, the Coiphoroi. Yeah, absolutely.
But the daughter is central to this, the loss, the murder of a daughter. It
was a slaughter. Yeah, sacrificial killing. So when the Greek army was massing at a place called Aulis in order to get a fair wind to sail to Troy 10 years earlier, the wind drops because the goddess Artemis has been offended, in most versions, by Agamemnon. He's done something wrong. This is absolutely no surprise to anyone who ever meets him in any version of any of his stories, where he's always crassly walking around being petulant and appalling. But he offends the goddess Artemis in some way, and he's told by their priest that the only way of making recompense to her, and thus allowing the wind to let them sail to Troy, is to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. And so he summons his daughter, who in most versions comes to Aulis with her mother, with Clytemnestra, for her wedding. She's going to marry Achilles, the great, the most incredible warrior that the Greeks have, and it is all a trick. And when she gets to the, as she perceives it, altar, it turns out not to be a wedding altar, but is a sacrificial altar, and she is, her throat is slit by her father, or she's stabbed by her father, and that is how the Greeks sail to Troy. And in some versions, including in Aeschylus, in the opening chorus of that play, she's gagged first, so she can't curse them. It is so awful what happens to Iphigenia.
And you say this. There's a suggestion that another child that Clytemnestra had was also sacrificed.
Well, sacrificed is overstating the case. I mean, just murdered, really.
Okay.
For no gain, really, other than his own petulance. Again, when Agamemnon and Clytemnestra meet, so earlier, long before Iphigenia is born, she's married to a man named Tantalus, and Agamemnon kills Tantalus, and she is nursing their child at the moment that this killing happens. And Agamemnon, this story is in Monologue in Euripides, Iphigenia, and Aulis. In Aulis.
I won't challenge it.
It's like, is it Iphigenia among the Taurians? I'm pretty sure it's Aulis. He takes the baby from her breast and smashes it on the ground. So when he kills Iphigenia, that's the second of her children he slaughtered. It's the first of his, I guess, but it's the second of hers. And so she waits for 10 years to take her revenge. And I thought, how interesting that we always think of her as a bad wife, when actually we should think of her as a good mother, shouldn't we? I like to think that, if you had a child and somebody did that, you would go all guns to... I'm not suggesting that retributive justice is the best way. Clearly it isn't. Clearly societal justice is better, with law and order and courts and police. But in a pre-that society, which is when Clytemnestra, why the hell wouldn't she? She says to the chorus, why is her life not important to you and his is? And that's a question that the more time I spent in her story, the less I felt able to answer. There is no reason why her life is worth less than his.
But of course, their son, takes a different view and feels then that he has to revenge the death of his father. Actually, you mentioned early on in the foreword to the book that your dissertation at Cambridge was about the murder of children in
women
Greek
murdering children.
Women murdering children.
I don't have children. If you're looking around for body parts behind me, there aren't any. Don't worry. Don't write in. Calm yourself. I haven't even got a pet. I've got a plant. It's fine.
Okay. Well, there seems to be a lot of it about, is all I can say. And in our next character, one of the great plays, the great roles for an actor, female actor, an actress, is Medea.
Yes, I mean, it is the greatest play ever written, in my view, in any language.
Really?
Yes. Oh God, yes. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. I love Euripides anyway. I love Greek tragedy anyway. But even by his standards, I think it is. I've been writing about it since I was 16, 17. And when I reread it for the 1,000,000th time for Pandora, I was still finding things in it. I was like, how haven't I noticed this before? How did I miss this piece of symbolism, or this echo, or this incredible bit of psychology? It's just the most extraordinary play. Medea is this incredible, complicated character who sometimes is presented to us as being basically a witch, and she certainly has witchy powers. We don't know this because the version that we tend to know is from the Harryhausen movie Jason and the Argonauts, where all the cool stuff that Medea does in Greek myth is done by Jason, right? So all the good stuff that women can do, hold on a minute, let's give it to her. Oh, just do me a favor. But that's what happens. So it is Jason who, for those of you who have memorized this film as I have, it's Jason who, for example, kills the bronze giant Talos. He gets help from Honor Blackman, the goddess Hera, who tells him what to do, but he has to go and do all the, brave stuff. So this huge bronze giant crashes to the ground and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. But in the version that we have in, for example, Apollonius of Rhodes, his epic poem, the Argonautica, it's Medea who takes on the bronze giant. The Argonauts are all just panicking, not unreasonably, because there's bronze giant throwing rocks at them. So very much on their side at this point. But Medea is ice calm. And she's just like, yep, don't worry, I've got this. And she calls down on her power from Hecate, who's the witchy goddess. And it's actually really harrowing. The giant has a sort of weak spot on his ankle. In the movie, it's like a plug. but she doesn't make him, she doesn't, you know, magic something to hit it. She magics him to injure himself with a rock at that point. She makes him kill himself. It's so unnerving. And so we have this idea of this extremely powerful, you know, she's a young woman who falls in love with an adventuring hero. Not that unusual, happens with Ariadne and Theseus and various other characters in myth, but she is simultaneously this extremely dangerous sorceress, I suppose.
And what you like talking about is, and contrasting, is the relationship between herself and Jason, when Jason basically again has gone off and hooked up with somebody else. But you can see there's the kernel of what was once a close relationship and the embers of it.
Yeah, their dialogue is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, all of it is amazing. The opening monologue of Euripides' Medea is so striking on the issue of how terrible it is to be a woman, that it was being read at suffrage meetings just over 100 years ago. And this is a monologue that was written by a man. It was originally performed by a man wearing a mask, because all Greek theatre worked like that. And almost certainly its original audience at the Dionysia, the theatre festival in Athens, it was almost certainly an all-male audience. We've got no evidence that says women were there, and women are generally excluded from civic life in Athens. So this incredible, entirely male-generated monologue was so extraordinary in how women's lives were, that, as I say, it was still being read at suffrage meetings 2,300 years later. The monologue in the middle, where she deliberates over whether or not she can really bring herself to kill her children, is one of the greatest psychological explorations of anger in any language at any point in history. But yes, you're right, these incredible dialogic exchanges, these agones, as they're called, where two characters just properly have a ding-dong, is how I would describe it in a slightly less high-minded way. It's just remarkable, because the way they exchange, and there are lots of these in tragedy, and you know, lots of them are good, but the way that Jason and Medea exchange their insults, you can feel the kind of chemistry. It's bristling with electricity. You know, she hurls insults at him and he hurls insults, and it's like bam, 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 and you can totally see that there is no way that this couple isn't going to destroy each other. But also, you can totally see why they fell for each other. You know, they know each other so well, and yet not ever well enough. You know, Jason is smart, but he's not as smart as she is, and he knows it, and it kills him, and she knows it, and she twists the knife. You know, they're at that exact point, and it is one of the reasons why the players perform so often, but also one of the reasons why it's, I guess, in some ways difficult to watch, is because it's such a contemporary feel. You know, most of us don't know. I'm extrapolating from my own life experience here, but I feel confident. Most of us don't know what it's like to accidentally kill our fathers and marry our mothers, but we have all seen a couple at this point in their relationship where all they can do is use everything that brought them together to twist the knife into each other. And it is so upsetting to watch, but this is what is captured so magnificently by Euripides in this play.
And the other thing, which is very difficult to watch, although it happens off stage, is when she does actually kill her children.
She does, and we hear it. I mean, we hear it. Even though it's off stage, we hear her children screaming, "There's no safe place for us to go to. Mother, don't hurt me." It's, oh my God, this is so harrowing. It is unbearably upsetting. It's a play I saw the first time when I was maybe 16, and my dad drove me to London from Birmingham, where I grew up, to see Diana Rigg play the part at the Almeida Theatre in Islington. And he obviously had a crush on Diana Rigg because he wasn't blind. And so he drove me down to London specially to see her with, you know, no vested interest of his own, I'm quite sure. And it was the most extraordinary thing I'd ever seen. This sort of completely blank stage, as I remember it anyway, with this sort of metal backdrop. And at the moment where Jason arrives, right near the end of the play, and says, you know, "Give me the bodies of my children to bury," she's destroyed everything. She's destroyed his new marriage. She's destroyed his capacity to stay in Corinth because she's slaughtered the entire royal family. She's really, really gone for it. And then he discovers she's killed his children. And he says, "Please, you know, let me have the bodies for burial." And as I remember it anyway, she certainly refuses in the Greek, but she banged the back wall, Diana Rigg banged the back wall, and these two huge metal panels, which were on wires, suddenly fell down, and the noise at the Almeida, which is not a big theatre, clattering against the back, was deafening, and the children's bodies were behind them. And I remember thinking at that moment, I'll never be the same again. I will never be the same again. And that was it. You know, I was lost to the theatre, to classics, to Euripides. It's like, I will never, this will always be a moment in my life where you can properly say, this is when I changed. It's like, I'll never stop studying this, ever.
Well, I can see why, as you say, it's such a powerful play, which has more than stood the test of time, but also to have the privilege of seeing Diana Rigg, because reading her recent obituaries, her stage work was phenomenal.
It was astonishing.
Really,
and I've seen her daughter play the role as well. I've seen Rachel Sterling play it too. I must have seen probably 30 productions of Medea in my adult life, starting with that one, which was an extremely high bar to set.
Yes.
I've seen one other that was almost as good, and generally, you know, some of them have been really not good at all. Some of them, like Rachel Sterling's, have been great, but yeah, it's the Diana Rigg one that I always come to in my mind when I have to think about it.
Well, as you say, a very important moment for a 16-year-old who was already engrossed in the classics. Let's talk a little bit about Helen of Troy.
Yes.
Another famous character. Fair to say she had a difficult childhood?
Yeah, again, it's one of those things we don't think about, because we think of her as Helen of Troy, the great seductress. You know, she has an affair, she has this adulterous relationship with Paris, they elope, and she causes the Trojan War. And you go, right, glad we sorted that out. What did Paris do again? But of course, she's not always Helen of Troy. She starts out as Helen of Sparta in southern Greece, the Peloponnese. And in fact, technically, the abduction of Helen, because in some versions of the Helen and Paris saga, she's kidnapped. In some versions, she goes willingly. But the abduction of Helen is responsible for 2 wars, not 1, 2. So there's the one where she leaves with Paris, where sometimes she's co-responsible and sometimes she isn't. But when she's a child, either 7 or 10, depending on our sources. And you know that they're squeamish when they're trying to round up to the nearest 10, my God. She's abducted by Theseus of Minotaur killing fame. And Theseus at the time is in his 50s. And he and his friend Perseus decide that they'd both like to marry a daughter of Zeus. And they flip a coin, not a coin because coins don't exist yet.
Yeah.
I mean, they draw straws or whatever. And they decide that Perseus should have Persephone, who's queen of the underworld. So they have to go down to the underworld to get her. Let's call that a needlessly risky idea. And Theseus will have Helen, who is 7 or 10 years old. And so they abduct Helen and stash her with a friend of his near Athens. Helen's brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, we sometimes call them Castor and Pollux, come to reclaim her, and a war begins because the Athenians don't know where she is, because they don't know that she's been abducted or where she's been stashed. And eventually the 2 brothers win, and they reclaim their sister, and indeed enslave Theseus's mother, whose name I think is Aethra, at the same time. And I guess what's interesting about that story is when I tell it like that, it doesn't sound, I mean, it's still abducting a child, but it doesn't sound too bad. In some versions of the story, she's already given birth to his daughter by the time that she's reclaimed by her brothers. So to suggest that she is not being raped as a child, that's not in the Greek, is all I can tell you. It's very much, and I thought how interesting it was that we just don't think about that story because it's horrible. And that if we were to, we would never think a child was responsible for starting a war. And yet we always think of Helen as being responsible for starting the Trojan War, when at most she's a kind of co-respondent, I suppose. And in a version of her story which dates back at least as far as Homer, so at least as far as the Iliad, she doesn't go to Troy at all, she goes to Egypt.
Yeah, and then you say, while in Troy, while Paris is killed, she's forced into another arranged marriage
with another Trojan. Yeah, and the words she uses, at least when she describes this in Euripides' play The Troades, Trojan Women, she says "bia" by force. Again, you know, we're pretty fluid in how we translate these things, and in my opinion, too fluid. We quite often will use phrases like abduct when what we mean is traffic. And this is one of those times. It's like, well, forced marriage it's not, oh, you made me marry a man I didn't like. It's like, no, yeah, and you know, she goes on to say that she tried to escape but got caught. There's an absolutely extraordinary moment in a fragment of a Sophocles play called The Demand for Helen's Return, where we see Helen on the verge of suicide. She's thinking about drinking bull's blood, which is deeply poisonous, because she feels such guilt for the Trojan War. And then I still can't believe it's one of these things where you're like, can this possibly be true? It feels so modern. but it's a 5th century fragment. And she's self-harming. She's scraping writing implements like pencils into her face. And I thought, my God, you know, the world's most beautiful woman trying to destroy that beauty with the tools that men have used to make her world famous for the beauty that she didn't ask for. How extraordinary. And that is 2,500 years old.
2,500 years old. You remark in the book that it's believed we've lost about 90% of the written word from the ancient world.
That's disappointing, isn't it?
Yeah. How do we know it's 90%? Is that a very naive question, or who's made up the estimate on the lost literature?
On what we lose?
On the 90%. Who said, we've only got 10% left?
I think this is the work of hardcore papyrologists and those kinds of scholars. So the people who are there looking at these manuscripts, and you have lists often, because sometimes when you lose, for example, a library at Alexandria, there'll be parchments, there'll be lists elsewhere, papyri, which will list all the books that were in this category or that category. Or we can look at, you know, the output of somebody like Cicero, and we know that he wrote, I think it was 9 books of letters. I mean, Sappho is a perfect illustration, right? We have other accounts which say that, because her work lasts for a long time. We don't have it, but it did last. And she wrote 9 books of lyric poems. We've got 3 poems, and one of those poems was released into the world in 2014. So until 6 years ago, we had 2. Our full poem collection of Sappho went up by 50% in 2014. But once there were 9 books. So we've lost way more than 90% of Sappho, for example. And yet lots of the things that we've lost, maybe we wouldn't have been that bothered about. But, you know, you only have to look at things like you know, sometimes it's like when we had the Oxyrhynchus papyri, of which there are still, I think I'm right to say, 100 boxes undug through and untranslated in Oxford. And there are only about 2 people in the world who are qualified to do it, so don't anyone kill them. But sometimes, you know, you go to the trouble, and it's like receipts or something. It gives you a list of, you know, which cattle were. Excuse me, could we have a lost play by Euripides instead, please? You know, you don't get to choose what survives, huh? But Sophocles is a good example. We know that he wrote between 100 and 150 plays, and we have 7.
You mentioned Euripides there, and you mentioned him several times in the book. 7 out of his 8 plays were about women, and you love the way
of the Trojan tragedies, yes.
Yeah, the tragedies. Sorry, the way he writes about clever, creative women, and the insight that he brings to that work of art. So he's one of the good guys.
He's on my good list. Yeah, Euripides is very much it's always an A-level question. So sometimes kids have to, you know, come and ask me at talks, you know, is he a misogynist or a feminist? Because Aristophanes accused him of being a misogynist, and all the women of Athens rise up against him in a play called The Poet and the Women, because he's always being so mean about them. And of course, because he's always showing them doing terrible things, like murdering children, for example. But clearly he's a great feminist before his time, even though this is a very anachronistic way of describing him, because he writes these incredible roles for women, and he has no hesitation about putting women at the center of the action. We have, I think I'm right to say, 18 of his plays, with 1 contested, the Rhesus maybe. And 8 of the surviving ones are about the Trojan War. And yes, 7 of them have women as the title characters: the Andromache, the Electra, the Helen, the Hecate, the Iphigenia and Aulis, Iphigenia among the Tarians, and the Trojan women. Euripides knows that if you want drama in a war, you go to where the women are. If you want an epic, obviously, you write the Iliad. But if you want the drama, then you go for the women. He just knew it, and he was right too, I think.
And if he knew the drama lay with the women, which is presumably why your next book is going to be a novel
yes,
based around Medusa. So you switch between your history and then your fiction.
Yes.
Does one inevitably follow the other? Will you do 2 history books in a row, or will you always go history, done, research?
I've done
now I'm going to use my imagination.
In a row. So I did Amber in 2014, Jocasta in 2017.
Yeah, and A Thousand Ships.
And Ships in 2019.
Yeah.
So to be honest, I was so demolished by the experience of writing Ships, which was quite a harrowing voyage to construct, that I felt like I needed a sort of, it's really lovely being able to do the research, but not having to be inside it, you know, to look at these women's stories from the outside, like I get to with Pandora, when it just becomes like, oh, this is so cool. Oh, let me tell you about this. Whereas having to imagine women who've gone through some of these experiences, it's quite hard going after a while. And especially in ships where there were so many of them, it was like giving house room to the most extraordinary damaged set of refugees. And it's like, I only have one brain and it's full. So yeah, my heart needed a rest. My brain was fine actually, but my heart needed a rest after ships. So Pandora
was a nice way to put it, actually.
Book, but my heart needed a little break.
Yeah, no, so that's a very nice way to put it, because sometimes we forget the toll it takes on an author if you're dealing with a highly emotional, dramatic, intense subject. Right. And it's in your head all the time. You can't sort of switch it off because you're going back to that story again the next day.
Yeah, no, you really live there. You live there for months and months and months. And by the time you finished editing it, it's usually well over a year for me. And I know I don't write particularly slowly relative to people who write longer books than I do, or just spend more time over them, I guess. And it costs you. I know that it's not going down a mine. I'm not pretending for 5 seconds that it's an arduous job. But emotionally, it's harrowing, and it can be anyway.
We're coming towards the end, Natalie, but one or two brief questions. There's so many gods in the ancient world, and I know you're a humanist.
Yes.
In the modern world. Is that because you couldn't make up your mind who the hell was the best god in the ancient world? I just
love them. I know it's really...
You love them all?
I feel really bad because as a humanist, I'm really supposed to not like gods as much as I do. But I do. And the worse they behave, I had the most fun writing them in ships, because obviously you can write these horrible, petulant female characters, which generally you sort of feel like you're slightly betraying the sisterhood if you write women like that. But they're so monstrous. I had the best time doing them. So yeah, no, I'm a terrible, terrible humanist, because even though I don't believe in gods, I like writing them and talking about them.
I'm sure the humanists, being the kind of people that you are and they are, they're not going to expel you for that.
I don't think so. Not least because Andrew Copson, who's their chief exec, is another classicist. So
oh, really?
I think I've just about made it under the wire because of it. But yeah.
Well, that's interesting. And as a classicist, because the other, we started the conversation a little bit about your early immersion in the world, in the ancient world. And I've seen a previous quote when you said that sometimes people would be surprised at how many comedians have actually studied the classics at some stage.
Lovely Andy Zaltzman for a start.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. Maybe we're just the kind of people who don't get proper jobs. Maybe there's a correlation between liking learning Greek for its own sake and liking dicking around on stage for its own sake. I mean, it feels like there's definitely potential here to draw a conclusion, and it might not necessarily be a very generous one about us. But there we are.
The big challenge for you, if you mentioned Andy Zaltzman, who's one of my favorite comedians as well.
What an excellent choice you've made, and a wonderful and delightful human being.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that, actually. And
yes.
I'm a big sports fan, and I've loved him on cricket over this summer. So your challenge would be to accumulate the amount of knowledge he has about cricket, which I think would probably take you the next 40 years or whatever.
I mean, I'll do cricket if he does knitting. I think that's only fair. I mean, that just seems fair to me. I'm happy. I will take this challenge on, Zaltzman, but you have to learn more than knit one, pearl one. That's my final offer.
I think that is a little clip that we may well use and put out the challenge to see what happens. Maybe next year, both of you could come to Harrogate and do knitting cricket, a sort of duopoly on stage.
Yeah, maybe I'll knit him a cricket jumper. That would be a nice thing to do, wouldn't it?
Pandora's Jar, Women in the Greek Myths. You've learned a lot, but there's a lot more to read and enjoy in Natalie Haynes' new book. So I'm going to say thank you, Natalie, for joining us at Harrogate.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And I just got to finish by reminding you that this has been a difficult year, obviously, for all book festivals. If you feel like donating to the festival, you can do so online at harrogateinternationalfestivals.com, harrogateinternationalfestivals.com, or you can donate by texting using the word HIF, hashtag HIF, and the number is 70085. But to Natalie Haynes, thank you for immensely enjoyable discussion, and thanks to Harrogate for making it all possible.